Hello, Eleanor Beaton here, and welcome back to another episode of the Woman-Owned Podcast and our second installment in our series, Capital is a Verb. So I've got a question for you. Have you ever had this experience where your business is making money? And in fact, when you look at where your business is, you know that you are so much further ahead of where you were 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. And yet you still have this inner feeling that despite the fact that your business is making more money, despite the fact that you may have more capital than you've ever had in your life, there's a part of you that still feels broke and that there is not enough. If this is you, throw away your money mindset books. This is not necessarily a money mindset problem. This is a problem about financial scoreboards, and I can't wait to get into it in this episode. Don't go anywhere. All right, this is our second installment in a 6-part series we are running called Capital is a Verb, and in this series, we are exploring one of the most important and underexplored topics in women's entrepreneurship, capital, i.e. money. We as women are taught how to earn money. Very few of us are taught how to deploy capital. If you want to build real economic power, enterprise value, and long-term wealth, understanding capital isn't optional. It is absolutely foundational. So let's get into it. I started encountering this feeling a few years into running my first business. And I grew my first business quite quickly. Every year I was sort of doubling my revenue year after year, which was very exciting. And what I started to notice is that even though each year I would generally have more money, more savings, my deals would be bigger, revenue would be higher, profit would be higher than it was the year before, I had this perpetual feeling of being kind of broke. And every time I used the money that I generated in the business to maybe hire a subcontractor or invest in a consultant or invest in attending a specific conference or trade show, I would be both excited about the investment that I was making, but I would also feel this real sort of guilt and this pang that I was just kind of losing money or spending money. And every time I spent money, I would register it as a loss. And this really confounded me. And over the years, I have seen this pattern in so many other women founders. So for instance, I was talking to an operator who has well over a year in capital reserves. Okay. So she has operating overhead. She has a full year of operating overhead in her cash reserves, which means that she's been able to get herself into a great position where the business has cash. And now she's built up her customer acquisition pipeline. It's straining delivery. She knows that she needs to make a hire, but she's really stalling on it because she just doesn't want to part with that capital. I can remember talking to another operator who had grown her monthly recurring revenue from about $15,000 per month to well over $40,000 per month, and still had this feeling of not enoughness and that she was quote unquote kind of broke. So maybe you can relate to this feeling, and it's very common. And typically the way that we start to deal with that is to hire a bookkeeper, to make sure we have a great accountant in place. Both of those things are really important. Maybe we will go and start reading some money mindset books. Those can certainly be helpful. But what I have noticed is that the problem isn't that we don't have great money mindset. The problem is that we don't have good financial help. One of the problems is that women are generally taught to only look at one financial scoreboard. And when it comes to being an entrepreneur who builds long-lasting wealth, who creates true enterprise value, there are not one, but two money scoreboards that you must know about, be educated about, and understand. And when you know those two financial scoreboards, you have a completely different lens around cash and capital deployment in the business. When you have only one financial scoreboard, you will almost always register any spending as a loss. and you will also very often feel broke, seemingly inexplicably. So let's get into the two financial scoreboards. Financial scoreboard number one is profit preservation. We're going to call that the profit preservation scoreboard. And financial scoreboard number two is the enterprise value scoreboard. These are not the same thing, and women are disproportionately handed the first scoreboard and disproportionately not handed the second scoreboard. So in today's episode, I'm going to describe what each scoreboard is. All right, profit preservation. This is the scoreboard that is basically handed to you by your bookkeeper, by your accountant, and we think about this as your P&L or your profit and loss. And basically the concept here is your business makes money, you spend money, and what's left at the end of the year is your profit. In this scoreboard, anything that you spend drives down profit. So let's say you're making money, like one of my first examples, you're generating revenue and you are growing, and that's great. And you realize, you know what, it would be a lot easier if I hired somebody to help me with delivery and I trained a team to engage in this delivery. So ultimately I reduce the company's dependence on me. Now that is going to show up negatively in your P&L, most probably, especially initially, right? Because you have to hire the person, you have to train the person. Very often you're not continuing to drive sales. You actually are probably, in the experience of most founders, your sales will probably slow for a quarter as you make sure that that hire is properly onboarded. And so at the end of that quarter, it may look as a loss. The money that you spent to hire that person actually drove down the profit. And if you look at just that one scoreboard, it's going to feel like a loss. Now, what we know about women founders is that this is the primary scoreboard we are handed, the profit and loss, the profit preservation. And under profit preservation, you do everything that you can in the business to generate as much profit as possible. And listen, I love the saying, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and all of that. But there are limits to the primacy of profit. So yes, you want to generate profit, but if I am talking to an operator and they have extremely high profit margins, first of all, I think that's great, but that also, it doesn't automatically make me be like, oh, wow, what a phenomenal operator. Typically, I'm going to take a look at how founder dependent is this business? How much capacity does this entrepreneur have? How much optionality does she have? Because that can absolutely tell a story. So what I'm trying to say here is that is one scoreboard. The profit preservation scoreboard is absolutely important. But if that is your only scoreboard, it can cause you to underinvest in growth, because according to that scoreboard, any spending that you do often will naturally depress profit. Now, let's talk about the enterprise value scoreboard. And I'm going to use the example of one of the most valuable companies in the world right now, and that is Amazon. Now, you may have all kinds of personal opinions about Amazon and personal opinions about Jeff Bezos, but I'm using this as a case study, okay? The interesting thing about Amazon is that it was unprofitable. It lost money every year for its first decade of operations, okay? I want you to think about that. Losing money every single year for a decade. And how would that make you feel? And what story would you tell yourself about what you were working on? The interesting thing, so according to that profit preservation scoreboard, Jeff Bezos sucked as a leader and an entrepreneur if we were just measuring that company according to that one financial scoreboard. But when you look at the other scoreboards, the enterprise value scoreboard, you see something different. So it's not that Jeff Bezos was not making money through Amazon, but what he was doing is he was deploying capital to build enterprise value. Very specifically, he was deploying money that he made and driving down capital to do things like build fulfillment and logistics, sort of the technical back end of related to fulfillment and logistics, things like warehousing, as an example. He was investing heavily in the technological underpinning of the company. He was investing heavily in the customer experience. He was investing heavily in Amazon Prime. So he was consciously spending, knowing that on that profit preservation scoreboard, it was going to look pretty bad. And it did. He didn't turn a profit for the first decade of the business. So one side of the scoreboard was looking pretty bad. But there was another side of the scoreboard, and that other side of the scoreboard is the enterprise value. And this is, are you building a valuable business? And very often when you are building a valuable business, the key ingredient to do this is money. So on the enterprise value side of the scoreboard, the question is, am I deploying capital to generate value in the business? And so I just gave you an example of how Jeff Bezos did that, driving down Amazon's profits so that they basically had none, but ultimately building the value of the business. If I go back to my earlier example of the founder who had over a year in cash reserves, which is phenomenal, but was really feeling weird and like, not wanting to part with capital to invest in hiring, over on that side, by hiring an employee to help with delivery, think about what she would have had to do there. So first, she reduces the company's dependence on her. She has to systematize what she does so that it can be repeatably recreated by another person. Both of those things create a business that is ultimately much more valuable should she choose to sell it. But what it also does is that it frees her up to sell more, and it creates a pattern now that she can then plug in a second delivery person. So by deploying that money, yes, it might show up initially as a fall in profit in the short term, but over time, it starts to create much more value. That is the enterprise value scorecard. And the interesting thing is that if you don't sit near investors, if you don't sit near people who understand about acquirers, like acquiring a business, if you aren't having conversations with people who are well-versed in strategic capital and deploying capital strategically, you often never get exposed to that second scorecard. And so you're building your business with half a scorecard. And of course, when you're building business with half a scorecard, when you know inherently that you should be making these investments to grow, all you're seeing is having it show up negatively in one scorecard rather than having it be balanced by our enterprise value scorecard. And I'll be honest, most of the people who are listening to the Safi podcast and most of the operators that we see in that sort of $500,000 to $5 million range are often too small, or maybe you have been labeled by venture capitalists that your business isn't scalable or isn't investment worthy. And for that reason, you don't get access to that viewpoint on the other side of the scorecard. And this is why I think having access to this podcast, having an actual capital framework is so critical so that you're able to make those strategic investments in order to be able to grow not only your revenue, but also the overall enterprise value of your business. Okay, so that is the two scoreboards and why you can so often feel broke. And it's because you don't have the two scoreboards to really provide that holistic lens on deploying capital effectively. So here's what I'm going to invite you to do. If this podcast episode resonates with you, I strongly encourage you to take our capital strength assessment. To take the capital strength assessment, go to safimedia.co/capital. safimedia.co/capital. And here's why you should take that assessment right now. The first is that most women founders don't have a capital problem. They actually have a capital framework problem. So often when we are working with founders, when we really sit down with them and start talking to them about strategic finance, they see they actually have access to more capital than they realize. And it's not that they don't have capital, they just don't have a framework that allows them to deploy it with confidence, to understand when they can deploy it. So they're really dependent on people like their bookkeeper or accountant. And you don't want to be dependent on those guys. You want to be a strong strategic partner to those guys. And so really having a strong sense of your own capital strength is really critical. In addition, capital strength is the bridge between revenue and economic power. Revenue alone does not create optionality, wealth, or enterprise value. The assessment reveals where your business is generating capital, protecting capital, or unintentionally leaking capital. And finally, every CEO needs her own capital framework. And this, I think, is really key. There are nuances between businesses and there are nuances between founders. And so what a strong capital framework does, like our capital framework, is that it is nuanced enough for you to define your own capital framework inside of it. So the goal isn't to become more aggressive with money. It's to become more precise with money. Assessment provides a very personalized read on your capital profile and the highest leverage move available to you right now. So to take that, go to safimedia.co/capital. It will make this episode really useful to you. And it's going to make all the future episodes in our Capital as a Verb series much more relevant to where you are right now. All right. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to come back to our next installment of the Capital is a Verb podcast series. And if you know of a woman operator who is really looking for business content that is sophisticated, that is advanced, and that is a cut above, I really encourage you to share this podcast with her. All right. We'll see you back here next week for another episode of Woman Owned. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode. If you found value in what I shared, please go ahead and like this video, give it a thumbs up, and leave me a review or leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next week.